Уважаемые коллеги, прежде всего хотел бы
First and foremost, I would once again like to express my gratitude to our Brazilian hosts for their traditional hospitality and the excellent organization of the BRICS ministerial meeting, as well as the additional meeting held with the participation of BRICS members and partner countries. These countries were represented today in accordance with the decision of the Kazan summit, where a historic decision was made under the Russian chairmanship to establish this category, the category of partner countries. These countries are Belarus, Bolivia, Kazakhstan, Cuba, Malaysia, Nigeria, Thailand, Uganda, and Uzbekistan. We agreed to continue actively involving partner countries in our joint work in a wide variety of formats, from ministerial meetings to expert-level and sectoral minister meetings. We advocated for the further strengthening of the role of BRICS and, more broadly, the countries of the global majority in addressing key contemporary challenges. We emphasized the importance of collective action by our association in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, ensuring security, and driving economic growth. Special attention was given to the continued advancement of reforms to international monetary and financial institutions, primarily, the revision of International Monetary Fund quotas. These quotas must reflect the actual economic weight of the countries of the Global South and East in the world economy and global finance. In this context, the majority of delegations stressed the destructive nature of the policies of the so-called collective West, which perhaps is no longer entirely collective, but all Western representatives still pursue the same goals: to continue living at the expense of others through neo-colonial practices. This includes unilateral illegitimate sanctions, abuse of the dominant position of their currencies in the international financial system, and unjustified trade protectionism, including the so-called tariff wars that are widely discussed today. We noted that in trying to preserve its fading dominance and continue reaping competitive advantages at others' expense, the Western minority is actively destabilizing the international financial and economic architecture. We had a detailed discussion on pressing regional and international political issues, including numerous crises in different parts of the world. Of particular concern are the worsening situations in the Palestinian territories, the Middle East more broadly, and various regions across the African continent. From our side, we emphasize that effective solutions to these problems would be supported by a consistent application of the principles of the UN Charter, not selectively, where one principle is pulled out or ignored depending on whose interests are at stake, but in their entirety and interconnection. We reaffirmed our position in support of UN Security Council reform, including support for India and Brazil as permanent members, while also addressing the issue of African representation. Naturally, we also spoke extensively about the situation in Ukraine. Once again, we laid out our principled approaches to resolving this conflict by addressing its root causes. These causes lie in the long-standing efforts to expand NATO eastward, right up to Russia's borders, and to draw Ukraine into the North Atlantic Alliance, thereby creating direct threats to our security at our very borders. We also emphasized the need to end the Kiev regime's adopted policy of eradicating everything related to Russia and the Russian world, including the Russian language, Russian culture, Russian language media, and the canonical Orthodox Church. Most participants in the meeting commented on the Ukraine situation, showing growing understanding of our positions, and we will continue this work. The final document of the meeting will be circulated by the Brazilian chairmanship, and we would like to wish our Brazilian friends success in preparing and hosting the 17th BRICS Summit, which will take place on July 6th to 7th here in Rio de Janeiro. There is no doubt that the summit will be a productive event and will further strengthen our strategic partnership, something Russia will fully support.
Sergey Viktorovich, hello. Do BRICS countries have a unified position regarding the trade war initiated by Donald Trump?
Well, we don't name names in the final document. It will be distributed later and contains our shared views on the current developments in the global economy. Most importantly, the final document confirms our shared conclusion about the negative consequences of the fragmentation of the global economy. We express concern about the weakening of multilateralism and the violation of fairness and inclusiveness, values that must lie at the heart of the trading system. The World Trade Organization, WTO, must remain the centerpiece of that system, although of course it needs to be adapted to modern realities. The document separately expresses concern over unilateral protectionist measures, including secondary sanctions, which violate WTO principles. It also highlights the unacceptability of blocking progress on WTO reform, in particular, the resumption of the dispute settlement body. So overall, I believe our position aligns closely with that of our BRICS colleagues and partner states. These shared views will form the foundation for the relevant documents at the upcoming BRICS summit in Rio de Janeiro on July 6 to 7th.
Sergey Viktorovich, this is Channel 1. Do BRICS members follow the Russia-U.S. negotiations, and what influence might those have on BRICS?
Certainly, everyone wants to understand how Moscow-Washington relations are evolving. This was mentioned in many speeches and bilateral meetings I had during the ministerial. We regularly inform our BRICS partners after each Russia-US contact, through our ambassadors and their embassies in Moscow, sharing our assessments. There's no need for secrecy here. We advocate for an honest, equal dialogue aimed at a balance of interests. The U.S. sends us similar signals. Work is ongoing across many areas, including right now, as we speak. It seems everyone sees the positive developments and hopes that the signals of a revived dialogue between Russia and the U.S. will materialize. I believe we'll soon see concrete proof of mutual interest. Russia will continue building its relations with the U.S. in a transparent way, but not at the expense of our strategic partners and like-minded friends.
Sergey Viktorovich, Andrei Yulinkin, Sputnik, Brazil. At last year's BRICS summit in Kazan, under Russia's chairmanship, the BRI payment system for national currency settlements was announced. Despite Trump's threats of draconian tariffs if BRICS abandons the dollar, Brazil has expressed full support. How is this initiative progressing?
The dialogue is progressing steadily. A meeting of BRICS finance ministers and central bank governors was recently held, in accordance with the Kazan Summit's directive, to explore the formation of independent payment systems. Our final document today notes the need to continue this work. There's a directive to use national currencies actively in mutual trade. Already, more than 65% of trade among BRICS members is done in national currencies. The dollar's share has dropped to 1/3. Tasks now include developing payment instruments and platforms, studying the creation of a cross-border payment system, an interdepository e-system called BRICS Clear, and a unified mechanism for trade and economic data exchange. We are also examining options for insurance and reinsurance systems, new grain trading platforms, and expanding this to other commodities. This strategy is reflected in the final document. It's a long-term strategic direction, shaped by the continuing unilateral actions of our Western colleagues, and a key priority of the BRICS agenda.
Anna Semyonova, Vesti. Sergey Viktorovich, is it possible for BRICS to create a new international judicial body to replace the ICC, which has clearly discredited itself?
This idea has been discussed, but it's not included in the final document. BRICS, in our view, shouldn't be about creating separate courts. We support international judicial processes that are based on broad consensus among all states. And yes, the International Criminal Court, ICC, as you rightly said, has completely discredited itself. It is manipulated by Western countries. Some states that blatantly violate international humanitarian law are shielded, while others are targeted without evidence. This includes politically motivated arrest warrants. The Russian Federation, independently of BRICS, is promoting an initiative at the UN to depoliticize international criminal justice and to prevent further abuse of international law. There must be no more cases where decisions affecting state immunity, which are enshrined in international law, are left to such biased bodies like the ICC. This will be a long process. In fact, the African Union once collectively considered withdrawing from the ICC, and those sentiments remain strong to this day.
Sergey, international experts say that in 2024, global military spending rose sharply by 10%, the worst since the Cold War. Can BRICS help pull the world back from the brink of a third world war?
Yes, I believe this fits perfectly with BRICS' position, to do everything possible to prevent such a catastrophe. But for this to become a reality, BRICS alone is not enough. This understanding that a third world war is unacceptable is shared even by countries outside BRICS, including, notably, statements from U.S. leaders. For example, Vice President J.D. Vance recently warned against provoking further conflict in Ukraine, and against attempts to drag European troops into the war under the guise of peacekeeping. I believe it is crucial to consolidate nuclear powers, especially the P5 members of the UN Security Council, around the positions laid out in previous joint nuclear statements, that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. This statement was adopted in January 2022 and is based on a long-standing agreement between the Soviet Union and the United States of America, when a joint declaration was issued confirming the following, namely, that a nuclear war cannot be won, and therefore, everything must be done to ensure it is never unleashed. Today, this task is extremely relevant, especially in the face of the reckless, aggressive actions and calls coming from the leadership of the European Union countries and from London.
In light of the recent meeting between the President of Russia and Trump's special envoy at the Kremlin, how do you assess the overall trends in Russia's international relations with its partners? Many are interpreting this meeting as a signal. Could it be that new opportunities are opening up for Russia in the wake of this contact?
As I've already said, under any circumstances, dialogue is always preferable. I'm somewhat surprised at how some countries are reacting to the processes taking place in Russian-American relations. Everyone treats these contacts between us and the Americans as some sort of sensation, though in reality, even during the Cold War, when ideological confrontation was very tough, dialogue never ceased. Today, in doctrinal U.S. documents, formulated during the Biden administration and not yet revoked, Russia is presented as the primary and immediate threat in the context of the Ukraine conflict, while the People's Republic of China is designated as the main long-term strategic rival. If you follow statements made by our Chinese friends in response to Washington's rhetoric, there's a very tough exchange of opinions on the issue of Taiwan, the South China Sea, and many other topics. But at no point has dialogue between Washington and Beijing been broken off. They talk, they meet, heads of state, foreign ministers, defense ministers, and security officials. So, I would caution against treating the current state of Russian-American dialogue as anything extraordinary. It's simply a return to normalcy. Those who view it as a sensation are merely trapped in the logic promoted by the Biden administration throughout its time in power, trying to portray Russia as a pariah state, isolated, with a shredded economy, etc. We are simply returning to normalcy, and I get the impression that most countries of the global South and East, our strategic partners and allies, view this positively.
Sergey Viktorovich, good day. President Putin has announced a new ceasefire, this time during the 80th anniversary celebrations of victory in the Great Patriotic War. In response, Ukraine's foreign minister immediately called on Russia to implement a ceasefire now, not just for 3 days but for 30. How do you comment on such statements? And is even a short-term ceasefire possible given the current approach of the Kyiv authorities?
I don't take the statements from representatives of the Ukrainian regime seriously, not at night, not in the morning. We know their value. Remember, just a month or two ago, Kyiv was issuing tough warnings that they wouldn't accept any ceasefire. European radicals were egging them on, saying a ceasefire or negotiations should only happen once Ukraine has the advantage on the battlefield. So let's pump them with more weapons, and then once Russia weakens, talk from a position of strength. Now suddenly, well, not so suddenly, considering what's happening on the ground, where the Ukrainian regime is steadily retreating, they've reversed their stance 180 degrees and are demanding an immediate ceasefire without any preconditions. We've seen this before. In February 2014, a ceasefire was declared between the opposition and then-President Yanukovych. A peace deal was signed calling for early elections and a national unity government. By morning, the ceasefire was trashed, government buildings were seized. The next ceasefire came with the Minsk agreements, after Kyiv's aggression against its own people failed. The agreements, endorsed by the UN Security Council, were later ignored by the Ukrainians. That was under Poroshenko. When Zelensky came to power promising to implement the Minsk agreements and restore peace, to end discrimination against the Russian language and allow Russian-speaking citizens to speak their mother tongue, he too failed to act. In December 2019, a summit in Paris brought together Merkel, Macron, Zelensky, and our president. A document was prepared calling for a ceasefire along the entire contact line, a key first step of the Minsk process. But Zelensky refused to sign it, saying he didn't want to stop hostilities because Russia might benefit. He proposed, as an experiment, a ceasefire on just 3 sections. We were surprised, but President Putin said, "Let's at least try something." The document was issued, even confirming the need to grant autonomy to the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. Yet Ukraine did nothing. On none of the 3 sections was the ceasefire respected. Later, in April 2022, a ceasefire was declared following the Istanbul talks, at the request of Ukrainians and Westerners. They asked us to make a goodwill gesture, pull troops back from Kiev to show readiness for peace. We did that. And what happened? Immediately, the West said, "Great, the Russians withdrew." Then came the Bucha provocation, which remains on the West's conscience. We still ask them to publish the names of the bodies shown in that footage. No response. Other ceasefires, for example, the one President Putin declared for Easter, were not respected by the Kiev regime. Many violations were recorded. Or take the ceasefire proposed by President Trump, a moratorium on strikes against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Russia fully observed it for 30 days. But it had no effect. There were around 200 violations recorded just by our side. These were sent to the UN, and I personally sent them to Marco Rubio. So we know the worth of these ceasefire calls. EU leaders like Kaja Kallas are now demanding Russia unconditionally accept a ceasefire, simply because they're losing on the battlefield. Their dream of delivering a strategic defeat to the Russian Federation will never come true, and everyone now understands that. President Putin's current proposal is for direct negotiations without preconditions. In this context, a ceasefire is seen as a precondition that would only be used to strengthen the Kiev regime's military capability. Remember, not long ago, President Lukashenko visited Moscow. At the press conference, when asked about President Putin's stance on the U.S. proposed 30-day ceasefire, Putin supported the idea, but said it needed to be structured so it wouldn't collapse like all the others. Previous attempts of this kind, he explained, show that on the entire line of contact, it is necessary to ensure clear, everyday, objective and transparent monitoring of who is doing what in order for the ceasefire to work and achieve its goal. Because the Ukrainian regime's ability to organize provocations is well known, and there is no doubt that these provocations would continue regardless of how the ceasefire is organized. We see no possibilities for honest monitoring to ensure compliance with this ceasefire. And the flagrant case, of course, is when yet another terrorist attack was organized against a Russian general, a vile, cowardly act, and when the West is silent on this issue. Meanwhile, Ukrainian representatives, including the heads of parliamentary committees, say that this is entirely the right course of action. The enemy must be destroyed, and they will continue to destroy the enemy whether there is a ceasefire or not. So here we will not fall for this trick again, and the president was very clear about this.
Anastasia Dombitskaya, Commerçant. Sergey Viktorovich, you recently said that Russia views the WTO as an organization that uses discriminatory approaches and even mentioned that Moscow might reconsider its obligations to it. Today, from your statement, it seems that in general, you agree with the Brazilian colleagues that the WTO could play a role in the current economic circumstances, assuming reforms take place. What influenced the change in this position? Did the position of the Brazilian colleagues play a role? And do you believe that the WTO can truly be revived? Here, there is no contradiction. The position has not changed. It's the same situation as with the United Nations Charter. The Charter itself is good and fully meets the requirements for strengthening multipolarity in international relations. The problem is that Western countries either apply it selectively or completely ignore it, pushing their own order based on rules. The same thing happens with the World Trade Organization. The principles it was founded on, if they were fully adhered to, would undoubtedly better serve the interests of all countries that are members of the WTO. But the problem is that these principles are not followed. The work of the key dispute resolution body has been blocked for many years, primarily by the United States, which does not want this body to address legitimate claims against the U.S. related to protectionist and other illegal measures. Therefore, we need to return to the basics, and this is exactly what is being said about the reform of the World Trade Organization. Not to overturn the principles of equality and mutual benefit, or fair competition, but to strengthen them and reach agreements for their implementation. There should be no more attempts to proclaim adherence to these principles in words, while in practice doing the opposite. This was very clearly formulated in the final document of our meeting. The BRICS presidency has a new round of expansion this year. Rather than focusing on the institutional consolidation of the group, I would like to understand from Russia's perspective when BRICS might be ready to resume a new round of expansion. Should this happen as soon as possible, or should difficulties in meeting, such as finding consensus on UN Security Council reform, be addressed before a new round of expansion takes place? Also, on this topic, I would like to know from the Russian perspective, how should the process for associate members, like Cuba, transition from associate membership to full membership. How does Russia envision this process? Thank you.
Regarding BRICS expansion, members have expressed that the group should be ready for a new round of expansion soon, ideally before the end of this year. The more members there are, the easier it will be for the group to adapt to the increased membership. The aspirations of many countries were taken into account when the category of partner countries was established, and this includes considering the potential for further membership. On this point, we have decided to spend this year assessing how the accommodation process will proceed. It is clear that the more members there are, the more we must work to ensure that security reforms, among other issues, are addressed. We have been committed to this for many years and will continue our efforts in this direction. Regarding the potential candidates for BRICS membership, Brazil and India are strong contenders for membership in the UN Security Council. There is flexibility on this issue, and it reflects the position of the BRICS membership on the matter. Moreover, the expansion process should move forward. We must ensure that it is smooth, as BRICS membership is closely tied to promoting dialogue and collaboration at international forums like the G20, where BRICS countries are working together with the G7 and other global partners. In the context of the new U.S. tariffs, BRICS has already commented on their negative effects on world trade and the global economic system. The final declaration from BRICS will emphasize the harmful effects of protectionist measures, including unilateral sanctions and secondary sanctions imposed by countries such as the United States and the European Union. BRICS will advocate for dialogue in international forums and seek mutually acceptable solutions rather than pursuing a win-lose approach. We are negotiating to balance interests, not to defeat anyone.